Hello and welcome. My name is Nicole LeBoeuf, and I am the Acting Assistant Administrator for NOAA's National Ocean Service. I want to acknowledge our friends in Rhode Island for being prepared to host the summit and for gracefully pivoting along with our conference leaders to make this virtual event successful. I hope to have the opportunity to come to Providence another time to see you in person and to see your cutting-edge work in habitat restoration along Narragansett Bay and your unique salt ponds, as well as your proactive efforts to prepare communities for a changing coastline and in the siting of offshore wind projects. Thank you to the Rhode Island Congressional Delegation as well, specifically to our ocean and coastal champion, Senator Whitehouse, for his steadfast support of NOAA and our partners in Rhode Island and nationwide. Although Rhode Island lays claim to being the ocean state, in my experience, when a person grows up coastal, no matter what state you're in, the ocean speaks to you loud and clear. I grew up on the Texas Gulf Coast, and my professional calling comes from an inherited and a purposefully nurtured love of the outdoors. From a young age, I birdwatched, crabbed, and fished the beaches, bayous, and coastal marshes of Texas and Louisiana. Those experiences shaped how I think and feel about life along our coasts and our nation's relationship to the ocean. And I have a very strong sense of place. But what if I had not grown up coastal? Would my life's trajectory have been the same? I was instilled with a deep respect for the natural world and for the power of the ocean. And for decades, I have advocated for its health. But what about people who did not have that same upbringing? Or what about those who may have lived up close to coastal resources and natural features, but didn't really get to know them? How do we connect communities to the coast? And when there are barriers, physical or systemic, how do we get those out of the way? And if we are unable to, how can we possibly expect the public to care about the fate of our coasts, our ocean, and all that lives there? At NOAA's National Ocean Service, our mission is centered around measuring, predicting, and assessing the risks to coastal communities from the impacts of coastal change, including climate change, specifically with respect to coastal inundation and sea level rise. Coastal communities. They sound quaint, sleepy, like places to get away to, and some are. But the reality is that there are 126 million people living along the US coasts. That's 40% of our nation's population in just 10% of our landmass. These people who live in this highly populated sliver of our country are experiencing increased environmental change, hazardous conditions, and disasters such as floodings and hurricanes. And these people are increasingly looking to NOAA and to the National Ocean Service in particular for information critical to making decisions about their lives along the coasts. They're coming to us for the science because NOAA is well known as a science agency. That's an accurate characterization because providing authoritative data is at the core of what NOAA does. But serving the public and helping people is also at the core of NOAA's identity. Coastal residents, businesses, partners, federal agencies, they are coming to us not just for data, but for our help as well. Of course, as scientists, we know that the information we provide to the public is only as good as the data that go into it and the boundary conditions that we, as humans, choose to set on our analyses. If we collect the right data, recruit and retain a diverse workforce, and serve all impacted communities, our products and services will be innovative, understood, and durable. Why is that? That's because without opening ourselves to life's full diversity within our ranks and our partnerships, our input data, attitudes, and our outcomes will be rife with biases, unconscious or otherwise. Along our coast, diverse communities, often underserved and underrepresented, face a myriad of inequities in terms of their ability to plan, to recover, and to remain resilient in the face of coastal change. Not only when it comes to accessing coastal resources and green space, but also when it comes to feeling the impacts, physically, financially, and mentally from coastal hazards. Disparities are exacerbated in crisis. Winds and waves and rising tides have no respect for municipal or socioeconomic boundaries. As the pace and extent of coastal flooding and erosion accelerate, climate change impacts along our coasts are exacerbating pre-existing social inequities. This has been documented in numerous studies and in publications like the Fourth National Climate Assessment. Also, as states and municipalities around the country struggle to deal with the economic impacts of COVID-19, they may be faced with difficult decisions regarding planned investments in communities that would have otherwise helped to address these challenges and increase resilience to future flooding and other coastal impacts. To achieve a resilient future, we need data and science, but we also need real, difficult conversations about how to act on that data, about who benefits and who pays under different approaches, about social and environmental equity, and about what kind of future we want for everyone. We need to better serve the underserved. And while we look inward to develop a more diverse workforce at NOS, we also need to make sure that we are serving a diverse constituency. I'm working very hard at this within the National Ocean Service and within NOAA. And I can tell you that the NOS Office for Coastal Management is doing so as well. For example, OCM recognizes that our work must include learning from community leaders and by listening to those who historically have been denied a seat at the table. OCM incorporates critical demographic and economic data in its decision support tools and trainings that focus on those in coastal communities most vulnerable to climate change risks, including children, the elderly, households where English isn't the primary language, and those in poverty. OCM also taps into the communities most at risk to growing coastal hazards to foster a more diverse and inclusive generation of coastal scientists, managers, and decision makers to help ensure that coastal practitioners are mirroring the communities they serve, and that we truly understand and empathize with the range of challenges that these communities face. Even at the federal level, where we can influence a great many things, we recognize that important advancement also happens on the ground. Today's keynote speaker will describe issues that urban communities face and will highlight the importance of empowering community members to overcome disconnects with nature and establish their own sense of place. Majora Carter is a real estate developer, urban revitalization strategy consultant, MacArthur Fellow, and Peabody award-winning broadcaster. She has used her visionary voice in city planning to redefine the field of environmental equality. A native of the South Bronx, Majora has brought about the Hunts Point Riverside Park, South Bronx's first open waterfront park in 60 years. She is responsible for the creation and successful implementation of numerous economic developments, technology and green infrastructure projects, policies, and job training, and placement systems. Majora creates vision, strategies, and developments that transform low-status communities into thriving mixed-use economic developments. She does this by harnessing capital flows resulting from American reurbanization among all ages, races, and income levels, helping to increase wealth-building opportunities across demographics historically left out of financial gain. Her work produces long-term fiscal benefits for governments, residents, and leading private real estate developments. Majora and I have complementary roles. NOAA provides authoritative data and tools to empower managers and decision makers. But you put those tools in the hands of innovative leaders like Majora, and the result is an empowered and enhanced communities and a foundation for more to come. It is my pleasure to introduce Majora Carter.
Hello. I am real excited to be able to have a chance to talk to you about a little bit about how our work kind of was informed by the environment that was around us and how we were able to use our ability to be a part of it as a way to do restoration and really help people think more about themselves within the natural world. So interestingly enough, when my parents came into, when my parents first came into the South Bronx, which is the neighborhood that I was born and raised in, it was a mostly white working class community. My parents were migrants from the Great Migration, coming from down south up into, in search of their great American dream. And they ended up settling in the South Bronx, which was a mostly white working class community at the time. Later on, other folks in search of their great American dream also came looking toward the north for that. And unfortunately, the real estate industry, which was also supported by housing policy from the federal level on down, that created white flight, which was often, involved with people saying, or real estate brokers saying, oh, the blacks are coming, therefore your property values are going to go down, and then selling to black families for much higher than properties were actually even worth. The great highway construction boom was all over this country. This is an image of the Cross Bronx being built in the Bronx in New York City. And it looks like a huge gash because it was literally housing as well as small thriving businesses were just destroyed, as a way to build this thing. Redlining, which is another phrase that was created in order to define where, by the banking industry and finance industries, as to where the type of loans and other type of financial financial things would come through specifically to support folks through mortgages and loans and things of that nature. And I was born in 10474, the zip code there. And I like to think that this is around the time that I came up. I'm sure I was talking to Santa Claus at this point, telling him that I was a really good girl and that he should take care of me come Christmas time. It was an early networking opportunity, you understand. But this is the South Bronx that I grew up in, because all of the financial disinvestment that, that was aided and supported, by housing policy, really made it so that landlords often would torch their building to collect insurance money, because that's all the kind of investment that was coming into communities like that. And so this is what I grew up in. This is literally 2 blocks away from the home I live in now and the one I grew up in. But now what all of that did was literally take this what was a thriving walk to work, both residential and light industrial community that provided lots of jobs, and created it and turned it into what was basically, a repository for much of the city's waste and infrastructure, waste and sewage treatment plants, sewage sludge pelletizing plants, power plants, and lots of truck trips as well. And it's interesting because what we noticed was that in those communities, even though there was a certain, approach to how they were dealt with, both from the municipal level, by philanthropy, and even from, well-meaning, I think, nonprofit groups within the community, it's almost as if poverty itself was a cultural attribute, even though much of the economic problems and the social problems were often, and the environmental problems were created from the outside in. It was almost as if poverty was something that was somehow internal to us, and neighborhood preservation was thought of as something that we should, it was just a given. And so poverty was just a part of that. And so we asked people within our own community, is that true? And we couldn't ask, is poverty a cultural attribute? Because that's really wonky and nobody talks like that. But we asked them, well, what are you looking for in the community you desire? And it turns out that they weren't looking for any of the things that were readily available here, from lots of health clinics that supported people, that had the type of lifestyle conditions like diabetes and obesity, and health and heart conditions that we know are actually often, a part of people's lives especially when they're poor. There weren't lots of community centers high on their lists, which are often the places that, most people who want to hang out in communities don't go to community centers. They're thought of as places that kids go to. No one liked litter on the street. No one was really attracted to having a lot of homeless shelters there either. But what they wanted were the same kind of things that people would look for if you would say from a middle class community. They wanted nice places to shop. They wanted nice places to hang out in. They wanted housing that matched their income. They wanted to hang out with people like them that really were aspirational and made them feel good about being in their own community. And definitely, last but not least, nice parks. People wanted to see really awesome parks where they could play no matter how much or little money they had. It was very high up on the list of the kind of things that people wanted to see happening. And when I came back to my neighborhood, because yes, I was one of the folks that was led to believe as a little kid that if you want to be successful, you've got to measure success by how far you get away from the community that you were born and raised in. And I was no exception. I use education to get out. But one of the things that we discovered pretty quickly when I came back home to go to graduate school was that it was clear why I left. You know, there weren't a lot of places that made me feel like I wanted to stay. It wasn't a diversity of food options. You know, there was not many great places to even shop, and many made me feel like definitely I wanted to get out of the neighborhood in order to experience something good. I like a bargain, but plenty of 99-cent stores, but pretty much that was our only retail opportunity. And again, lots of pharmacies that were there. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry that literally took care of the lifestyle, you know, medical conditions that a lot of people have, you know, in poor communities. And also another ways to self-medicate. You know, there was just block per block, plenty of things like liquor stores as well. There weren't many places to create opportunities for you to increase your financial well-being, but there were plenty of ways to get it extracted. So things like check cashing stores and payday loan places and pawn shops versus things like banks or credit unions. And definitely lots and lots of very highly subsidized affordable housing. And that was pretty much it. And so before anybody says, oh, these are the type of things that people feel like Majora Carter kind of hates poor people because she's talking about these things that are in poor communities. No, what the problem is that we were literally thinking that, and statistics actually proved it out, that when you concentrate these type of infrastructure, you concentrate the type of poverty that actually increases things like poor health outcomes, low educational attainment, higher rates of people being involved in the justice system or having families being touched by it in some way, shape, or form. And it just, you know, sort of creates a kind of lack of hope. And so we really felt, you know, as community developers, that part of what we needed to do was literally change the dynamic of what people were seeing. And I first started working as a community developer in the sustainability world. And because at the time I moved back to my neighborhood, our city and state were planning on building a huge waste facility on our waterfront. We handled about 40% of the city's waste infrastructure at the time. And so the kind of, as we were thinking about the talent retention strategy, what it was all about, what I'm about to tell you, but specifically, this is what it looks like. You want to have a beautiful, high quality built environment and places that promote community and make you feel like good things are happening, but aren't necessarily community centers that often a lot of folks are not all that excited about. And last but definitely not least, do not conflate poverty with it as a cultural attribute within our communities. So going back to the fact that, you know, when I moved back to the neighborhood and our city was planning on building this huge waste facility, it was actually sort of a talent repulsion exercise that they were embarking on. And our focus was more along the lines of how do we help our community see that there's something to look forward to in this community. Again, trying to think about the talent that's already here and retain it versus thinking about, you know, we just have to just continue to fight because it's bad. But no, what can we do in our community to actually make it look like it's someplace we want to be in? And so we actually were, interestingly enough, around the same time that we were advocating for more substantial and sustainable solid waste management plans that didn't openly discriminate against poor people of color in New York City. We were also approached by, because you have a small grant program from the U.S. Forest Service, that was specifically about helping to restore America's threatened urban rivers. And we certainly had one. As a matter of fact, this one in particular, actually can't see it from here, but this is what, there was a dead end street that was literally going to be the connection to a bridge across the Bronx River. And I knew that we had a Bronx River, but I'd never seen it except on a subway map. But it turns out that the Bronx River actually literally went right through my neighborhood. And so we found out about this grant program, wrote a very small grant, which basically paid for lunch and, you know, some cleanups and things like that, you know, community programming at the site. But mostly what it allowed us to do was create pretty decent public-private partnerships that allowed, you know, the development, you know, of the cleanup of this area. And so it was a dead end street when it had been used as a dump for decades. And so the cleanups were substantial. This was the very first beta version that we did. But again, even though it was, we had a waterfront on, you know, within 6 blocks, less than that, you know, of the nearest resident in our community, most people didn't know that there was any a place to what to do on the waterfront. So we created some programming that allowed folks to do just that. So boat building, environmental stewardship, we had all sorts of parties down on the river, but the idea was literally just to get people connected to the waterfront as a way to show them that this is theirs for them to engage with and enjoy. And so that we can think about the environment as an extension of our own community rather than like something that exists outside of it. And again, it made, because we knew that people were leaving our communities in order to experience that. So this, I love this photo of me. It's, you know, this is me when we were literally doing the groundbreaking for the Hunts Point Riverside Park. We got about $3.2 million to actually do it all over. And so it went from this to this. And and back in 2006. And it really was an incredible way for the community to see itself. And I got married there back in 2006 as well. And that dog is really the reason why I walked into that dump the very first time, because Lord knows I would not have gone into it. There were weeds and piles of garbage over my head. So she deserved to be my flower girl. And so, but again, having this type of thing to make people feel like something wonderful is there for their community was a great way to get them connected to the natural world. Another piece was the South Bronx Greenway. I wrote the original proposal back in 2000, around 2000. And, you know, it literally called for about 11 miles of both on water and on street, you know, bike paths and walkways to connect people to the waterfront and to the larger, greenways as part of network as well, because there's a greenway that goes all the way from Maine to Miami. It used to bypass the South Bronx. It doesn't anymore. Yay. But anyway, the original proposal, you know, called for just a certain few key connections. One of them was to like a 450-acre park called Randall's Island, and it was literally separated by 25 feet of water at the end of this pathway here. And so we were able to build that, get that built over it. We were able to leverage, you know, lots of both cities, federal and state money in order to build this connection. And this is also one of my favorite pictures, me at the completion, you know, of the site itself. And so this literally now connects us to that. We have big wide streets up here. This was another way, you know, building greenways and planting the medians was another way to not just, you know, create traffic calming, but also to create deal with urban heat island as well. And, you know, we did it on a few streets within the community, which really makes me happy. But the problem, in which I'm going to show you right now, is that the maintenance was not really included. So this is a real big key, whether it's estuaries or whether it's, you know, things that are happening, you know, within the local community, not necessarily on the waterfront. These were actually weeds, allegedly. They look nice to us, but we were just, because green was better than this. And which looks like sort of like an urban, a lunar moonscape, and not very nice. So, you know, reinforcing the fact that maintenance needs to be included in all of this is super important. We also started, back when I ran a nonprofit called Sustainable South Bronx, we did project-based environmental and economic development. And these guys were called Greenway Stewards, and they went through our green jobs training and placement system. And we actually hired these guys instead of, letting them be hired by somebody else. And their job was literally to be the ambassadors of sustainability within the community. So here they are, like working on street trees. And so one of the things they did in one particular area was there was this one tree, you're looking kind of close to it now, but it was so big and shady that it literally blocked the rays of that big, huge street light over there. And underneath this other tree, it was so dark that all sorts of illicit activity would go literally on in the shadow of darkness. But when they, did some urban, when they actually unplanted, when they, did a strategic pruning, literally it shed light on the subject, and suddenly people were able to walk there because light was there, and good uses will always drive out bad uses. And it was wonderful. And they became heroes of the neighborhood after they did that strategic tree pruning. It's called crime prevention through environmental design. But here, as you can see, they kept the tree canopy very low because this was across the street from a senior citizen center, and folks would come outside and literally sit, and they've also built the little seat underneath the trees as well as a way to kind of get people to think about how nice it would be to just be outside, because we know social isolation, especially for seniors, is a really difficult thing for them it just literally took years off their lives. So this was a way to get people thinking about just being outside again and being happy. This was like a really interesting wayfinding experiment that we did that worked really well. We rented a line painting machine, and literally the Greenway Stewards, just without any interpretation, just painted a line, from like the main, like from by the subway and like the main, thoroughfares within pedestrian thoroughfares within the neighborhood, and just painted the line and then went down to the parks, because we didn't initially have any kind of maintenance, we didn't have any kind of marketing budget. So it was just like enough, because you make a path, people kind of follow. They don't even know why, they just are being led that way. It's really funny. And we watched them. We did our own little non-scientific experiments of just watching people look at the thing and just following it. It was the funniest thing in the world, but it worked. And this is a sewage processing plant that, a really major one, obviously, but and this is another smaller kind that we have digesters, within New York City as well. But the deal with how do you reduce the amount of flow that goes through them and out into our waterways is often by like creating more ways for water to be absorbed into the natural environment, or dealing with urban heat island effects, because we know that frankly, it also vegetated surfaces make our city cooler too, not to mention the fact that you're reducing the amount of water that it needs to be processed by sewage treatment plants. And so we did actually one of the first, community-led green and cool roof demonstration projects within, a while back. And then later on, we were able to show that use it as a demonstration to show what's possible. We translated this into legislation that got transferred, one of the very first green roof tax abatement programs here in New York City, which was really incredible. And it was even used for urban farming as well. So we're very excited for the rooftop farms that are on top of our roofs, many of them in New York City right now. And then we also started a social enterprise called Smart Roofs, which is now has been acquired by another organization, but it literally was a path into green infrastructure jobs for many of the folks that we worked with. So we were super excited about that. And I was literally the first client for this company, and this is the green roof that's on top of my building. And literally, this is a Google map of it. But imagine what it's going to look like when we start thinking that there's really shouldn't be any difference between the urban landscape, and the rural, and our waterways, and that it's all one connected ecosystem. And as we work to make sure that that kind of stuff happens. So we think about that, and I certainly think we want to close with, Dr. King's a portion of his speech from or his letter from a Birmingham jail. And, where he really, drove home the fact that integration is not something that we should be waiting on, and we should be impatient about it. And I feel the same way about sustainability. And even though our talent retention strategy and real estate development, extends, beyond, just the natural environment, it goes to the built environment as well. It really does speak volumes to the fact that we can create the kind of, monuments to hope and possibilities within our communities that show that we don't have to move out of our neighborhood to live in a better one. Thank you. Hello.
Well, Majora and Nicole, thank you so much for that. It was really great to learn a little bit more about the work you've done and the organizations you're with. I want to introduce myself quickly to folks watching. My name is Mike O'Brien. I am a volunteer with a nonprofit called EarthCorp. I'm on their board. They're based in Seattle. They do habitat restoration by bringing together young adults that are passionate about work from around the country and around the globe into Seattle to work on parks and open spaces in and near Seattle. And it's a really amazing model, working with volunteers on the ground to do some of the work to turn our parks into amazing spots. Majora, I wanted to start with you. First, let me let all the attendees know it's great to have so many folks watching today. We will be fielding questions from you all. There's a spot in the chat where you can label questions. So just type your questions in there, and I will do my best to moderate and make sure that Majora and Nicole get a chance to answer as many questions as we have. But I wanted to start. With a question to you, Majora. The examples of what you've done in South Bronx is really amazing. The history of the obstacles that had to be overcome. And I'm curious, you did some of this work within the existing systems and structures. I'm sure you're grateful for a grant for lunch on one of these, but I imagine those systems and structures often stood in as an obstacle, not support for you. Yeah. And for those of us around the country and other communities, what are the types of things that we should be doing within those structures to change them, to make it easier for folks to accomplish what you've been able to accomplish?
Making friends, and lots of them. Maybe it was because I was a little bit older. I was 30 something, I think, when I first started. So, and done a lot of things before that, and was just sort of like, wait a second, there's no way we can do this by ourselves. And so for us, it was really clear that if we want that the problems were so big that we were going to have to really connect with our with elected officials, with agencies, with businesses. Like there was literally no way, we knew that there was power, in being the community as well, but it was just like, how much more powerful could we be if we found what was in common with all of us and then work toward that? And the Bronx River was a really tremendous example of that, because we worked with city, state, federal agencies, including NOAA, as part of like the Bronx River Working Group, and our goal was to literally come together and figure out ways to create more of opportunities that would make it an educational, economic, recreational, spiritual resource for the community that literally, up until we started doing that work, most of us, present company included, didn't really know it was there. Like, we knew it was there, but it was like, it's not ours. I mean, rivers belong in rural areas and whatever, they're not here. And that's the way we felt. And it was just understood. And then it was just like, whoa, this could be amazing. And it was, I mean, it really was some of the most exciting times of my life. And I've had a bunch of exciting times, but that was just watching it grow and being connected, to a much larger ecosystem of people it just made it so much sweeter. It really did.
That's amazing. Nicole, you are part of one of those institutions that provides support at times, and I imagine is a large bureaucracy that, even at its best, is probably hard to navigate and probably has some structural barriers that make it harder for certain communities to access the resources. What has your experience been within NOAA? And maybe tell us just a little bit about the history and size of the organization.
Sure, thanks. And Majora, your story was fantastic. Really, really enjoyed that. I wanted to go there right away. I did. I was like, when can I go? It's interesting. So many of the things we do at the national level are big, and they're big in scope, or they're big in time frame and horizon and that kind of thing. But effects, like the ones that Majora showed us, are local, and the participation has to be local. And so one of the elements that we really try and stress in many of our grant programs is the smaller sized grants, the localized grants, really working within the community. We do a lot of capacity building at the National Ocean Service, because we know that we cannot do it all, and we shouldn't do it all. I don't think that's the federal government's role, but we can empower others, train the trainers, and teach people on the ground to do things that they can continue to do without us. And so that's one of the emphases that we really try and have at the Ocean Service. And we do work with extension agents and coastal planners, for example, at very local levels, and we're always on standby to offer assistance and expertise. But we, like I said, we also really appreciate the need to pull the community in and have them a part of the process. And so that's one of the areas of emphasis across our programs, depending on the coastal nature of it, where we really try and hand that off to others, because it's a place that we can offer solutions and assistance, but we can't be there through the whole thing. And honestly, if we were, the ownership would not be the same on the ground. And so I think it's important to find that right balance within our programs.
Great. Majora, you clearly are deeply rooted in your community, and the investments that you collectively have made from the presentation you've shown looks like it's really transformed it in wonderful ways. How has the community changed in response to that? And have the demographics shifted because of some of this beauty, and positive and negatives about that?
It's interesting, because when we first started, there definitely was kind of like, because there was this feeling, and I definitely want to talk to you a little bit more, Nicole, about some of your earlier comments, because I think this actually kind of speaks to it. Because they were very poor community, lots of social issues, health, education, all of it. There was almost this feeling that the environment was something that belonged to white people. Like, I kid you not. And but that's, I think, honestly, like the crazy, very effective part of white supremacy, to be straight up. It's just sort of like the nice wide open spaces. That's where white people go to camp. Black people don't camp. People, Latinos don't camp. We don't do that kind of stuff, even though we know that's not true either. But I mean, I remember getting, like, from some people, not everybody, kind of like, we got so many other problems. Why are you working on that? And then it was just sort of like, because community, it's not just a place, it's also an activity, but you need to, like, rebuild our connection to the land, so that we realize that we can develop all sorts of great ways of being together. And if your environment around you looks really bad, it will reflect on you. You will not want to protect it. You will want to flee, period. So I actually thought of the work that we were doing, the more I learned about sustainability, the more I learned about the environment, the more I was just like, oh, no, that's where we have to start. But it was so fascinating to me. This is the story kind of like tells you a little bit about what it was. I remember I was traveling and I got word. I was actually on the West Coast, actually in Seattle, and I got word that our park, this was 4 years after it was built, got vandalized. And I was just like, and it made the news, like it made network news. It was just like, oh my gosh, this beautiful park, as we just won this national award for excellence in urban design. And I was just like, oh my God, like I was just like, who do I got to call? But I was working. I literally couldn't stop what I was doing, to like, call the electeds and agencies, in my neighborhood. It was just like, I'm sorry, you got a job, stop, do your work. And so I couldn't do anything. But by the time I got back, 3 days later, it was as if nothing, I mean, every surface had been, painted over or cleaned up or whatever. I never even knew anything happened, because in the news story, people were just like, oh, no, you cannot do this. You cannot come to my neighborhood and do this, because this is our park. This is ours. Like, this is beautiful. How dare somebody do this? And it was like, because of the public support for it, our parks department and sanitation cleaned it up right away. And so I actually never saw anything but a picture of what it did, of what it looked like when it was messed up. And it really speaks to, I think, the fact that people were able to go, wait a second, this does have meaning to me. And why would it not? And I'm going to fight for it and just make sure it is everything that I need it to be. And so it was a really kind of telling thing. So I think to your question, Mike, obviously it really has been embraced by the community. It's kind of like people think it was there forever. And it's just like, and I'm just like, you know what? You think that, but because that's when you know they've taken ownership of it. And then the job is no longer just mine. It's somebody else's, you know, and it's shared. It's not somebody else's. It's shared amongst us. So I don't have to feel like I have to do the work, which sort of made me think about what you talked about, Nicole. This is sort of like being in partnership with local communities. Mm-hmm. It's like, why would you want to do all the work? Like everything you do is so much stronger when we all see why the commonalities within it and how it actually supports us. You know, some of us may never actually experience, you know, the ocean, certainly the way that many folks from NOAA do, and the kind of things that you're actively working on. But by creating these smaller, whether they're pocket parks or, you know, just, you know, waterfront, you know, estuaries of places where this can happen, it literally, I think, connects people, you know, to a much larger world, whether they see it or not. And that supports your work. And I just think, like, yeah, I thought that you developing those type of partnerships is one of the most powerful things that you could have done for the agency, but also it was a gift to us. Absolutely. And I so appreciate it. Literally, to this day, I'm very excited about it all.
Well, and Majora, you've given the gift of nature to a community, and as you know, nature is restorative. It's healing. It's for everyone. It's different things, but to not have it in your life, or even more, as you spoke to, not to believing that you don't have it, which is different. Yes. It is an active an active thought to think that's not for me.
Right.
That's heartbreaking to think that someone might not only not have it, but to have a sense that it is not for them.
Yeah.
Because it's so powerful to have in your life.
Yeah, I agree.
Majora, you mentioned, you know, who is the environment for? And I'm also on the board of the Sierra Club, and it's a nonprofit environmental group that's been around over 125 years. And, you know, starting in the 1800s, you know, that movement was explicitly designed for white people. And sometimes, often, frankly, at the expense of other communities. You know, indigenous people had to be removed from land so that we could make it a parkland that felt comforting to white people. And well, I want to believe that history is not where we want to be today. The legacy of that still is embedded in the work we do.
Yeah, it is. Totally. And that's why it's so important that being consistent, you know, about partnering, you know, and as crazy and as awful, you know, the present state of our overall environment is right now. You know, and it is really scary, but, you know, between the racial unrest and, you know, being in the middle of a pandemic, you know, and knowing that, you know, issues do affect, you know, the most vulnerable, you know, populations, whether they're poor, you know, of color, you know, much more intensely, you know, knowing that and acknowledging it, and then just going, okay, like, what do we do now? It's like, just, you know, it's sort of like being in a 12-step, you know, program. Like, first you got to understand there's a problem. Then you can move to step 2. Okay, let's move to step 2 and then get further on, because, you know, the thing is, we're all gonna win when we all win. I mean, that's the thing that I love about nature is that it is naturally regenerative. I think that might have been like almost felt like a double negative to be naturally regenerative. I don't know, but anyway, it seems it is, you know, like the more, it's kind of like love. When you give it, it actually, the more it sustains itself, and then you can keep giving more. I find so. If now isn't a perfect time, you know, to try that out and test it out, I think especially when it comes down to, you know, how we can deal with our land, and, you know, knowing full well that climate's obviously having an issue, and especially in coastal communities and in urban ones. The more we can make people feel like they're a part of the solution to save the world, the better off we're all going to be. You know, like, this is everybody's problem, but everybody's win. Yeah.
So true.
Mm-hmm.
Majora, we have a question, actually, for probably both Majora and Nicole, asking about green jobs and living wages. And so both during the project like this, like the ones you've worked on, and afterwards, what are the tools you need to sustain living wage jobs in the community that these projects actually support, both in construction and maintenance ongoing?
Yeah, they weren't, not all of them were in the community. I mean, we had a very large, it was a pretty intensive training that they went through. It was only 12 weeks, but it was pretty kind of cool. So there was brownfield marine remediation, so all the OSHA's, different training things they did, as well as wetland restoration, and various, urban forestry, things that worked. I mean, we had people working, in places like cemeteries, and doing the urban, the horticultural, the aspects there, as well as in, just straight up maintenance as well, brownfield remediation too. And, the bottom line is, it's like they were all like living wage jobs. Like, that was the interesting thing. And, some more than others, honestly. The more technical stuff was, I mean, we had one guy who worked like 6 months, had made like $60,000 and was just like, oh, now I can go and like, hang out with my family. And then he came back up. But it was just like a really interesting kind of thing. And it was just a really simple way. But, we did a lot of work also. And I realize now that why, we made sure they were living wage jobs. We actually would interview employers, beforehand, just to see, what was out there. And so we did that was a big push to make sure that the jobs actually did exist. And we went specifically in fields where it happened. So it wasn't, I think that's why it's also super important, but as we think about the future of sustainability, and in particular, look at it from that economic lens. It's like, specifically, what can we be building? Can we actually be thinking and quantify, what's the impact of doing things like, helping to, bolster up communities, against the kind of the kind of environmental issues that are going to be impacted by climate. Is it cheaper to pay for them now and support that versus paying for it later? And those are the type of questions that I think our, electeds and agencies and just the general population needs to be talking about, because, because it's always more expensive to rebuild after the fact versus actually trying to make communities more resilient. And that's the kind of green job, work that I feel, unfortunately, we've never really, like, there was always like I think a pushback when I was actually working in the field, more for training dollars as opposed to exploration dollars about, well, where are the industries? How do we make sure that we're creating industries so that we can create more resiliency going forward? And I was unable to like push that agenda, and it still kills me right now that I couldn't get anybody to listen, because it was sexier to think about training programs than it was to think about the less sexy aspect of what are we building in the future. And it's not fun work, but it needed to be done, and it just wasn't.
Nicole, what do you, I haven't ever applied for a grant with NOAA, but I've worked with government agencies before, and oftentimes there's pressure to really stretch the dollars and get the biggest bang for the buck. And that drives for like, an application that's like, we're gonna have lots of volunteer work on the ground, and we can, for only $100, look how much we can get done. But that often cuts against the idea of developing the type of talent and careers that long-term are sustainable for community. How does NOAA interact with that, and when you're putting out grant applications and supporting communities?
Well, I think you are generally right about that aspect of it. We also see a lot of potential in, I'll say restoration, natural habitat restoration, for example, as offering a wide range of jobs, from the highly technical restoration type jobs all the way down to, the skills that don't take a lot of training in habitat restoration. And so we're trying to provide a wide range of opportunities. But, you know, I think to one of Majora's points, which I think is where we are trying to go more toward, and that's the quantification of the benefits, either in avoiding costs, which is not as sexy to quantify, right? People don't want to talk about cost avoidance. But we're pushing because, and I'll tell you what's helping us, and this is a very sad story, but it is one natural disaster after another. Right. So every time the government has to pay out for a hurricane supplemental or the wildfire supplemental, whatever that is, we begin to be able to quantify what was lost in a way that we can also, you know, we can project in time and say, let's try and avoid that in the future. It is really hard to do. We are working on that in coastal regions. Our Office for Coastal Management just recently worked with the Bureau of Economic Analysis and NOAA's chief economist to develop the first of its kind prototype statistics on the U.S. marine economy. And I'm mentioning that because it's just a baby step. Wow. You know, it's just the beginning of saying, here's how much this sliver of land along our coast contributes to the rest of our economy. And there are, it's awesome. There are big players like our ports, right? There's some big players there, but it's also the beginning of our ability to say, here's what's at risk, right? And that's really important to us because that is not just jobs that our grants can provide, but jobs that can be, you know, valued in such a way where it's across every sector along this area of coastline that it could be, not only could contribute to the U.S. economy, but could be lost if it's not resilient. And so it's just the beginning, but it is, yeah, everyone says, yeah, let's pick up a shovel, but we need to be paying people for the work. You're absolutely right. And one of the ways, at least, that we're trying to focus on is to put dollars on it. So as Majora said, so elected officials and others can speak that language and say, well, here's the cost benefit of bringing this into my community or in investing in this area. Cost avoidance is harder to talk about. It's not harder to talk about, it's harder to get traction on. Yes. But we're really, really trying because we believe that these communities are so important to the rest of our country. And we have a lot of change going on along the coasts.
Yeah. You've got to send that to me.
I absolutely will. It's just a baby step and it's so exciting. It's so exciting.
Here, I really am. Because once we get to that point where it becomes a part of the economy and not like this cute little thing, because I think right now still sustainability is considered like, oh, that's cute. It's not like real, and
right,
and it's just not, and I don't understand why, but I think we should make like a calendar of like really cute people doing, you know, sustainability. I have no idea. I just feel like I don't understand why this stuff isn't like just all over the place, but it's not. It drives me crazy.
Hopefully we'll get this soon. That's a good pivot, Majora, to a question. So someone really liked in the question area wants to know more about the Greenway Stewards and is really impressed by that and asked if you could speak to how overcoming barriers to capacity building and more specifically, how do you build a community of local stewards around your project sites?
Yeah, literally they were ambassadors. Like we put them in, you know, their chinos were always pressed, you know, clean t-shirts, you know, they had to like be clean shaven and, you know, get good haircuts and the whole shebang. And they would walk around literally on our main thoroughfare, even before we had most street trees planted, you know, and they would like literally go with the basket and they'd like clean up and talk and, you know, in front of people's, you know, in front of their storefronts. And, you know, after a while, people were just like, and they tell them about the few trees that were there and why they were important to take care of. And people would be like, what, trees can do that? You know, and storefront owners would do things like, you know, bring out drinks to them if it was a hot day. And, you know, and literally that one example of them doing the strategic street, you know, tree pruning, and it was an old growth tree. So it was like, no one wanted to cut the thing down, but it did need a pruning. And, but when they just let light in, like literally, like I got fan calls, like literally a little old lady called me, left a message on my voicemail. She's just like, I just met this young man, who told me about trees and I didn't know, and I appreciate you and thank you very much. And it was really, really sweet. But it basically is like, you have to be in people's faces in a way that show them you're not going anywhere and give them information that they might not have thought of on their own. And the consistency of it, which is why they were like, part of your day, it's like you will be walking outside straight up. I don't care what the weather is, they got good clothing, raincoats, whatever, but you're outside because people need to see you. They need to know that you're there and that you've got a message. And once they did that, it was really powerful. But I think that's, people forget how long it took for us to, to screw things up. And then there's like, well, it should just be fixed right away. And it's just like, you got to build trust. You have to build fun. And you have to like remind people that there's better things that can happen. And if you just do it once and you think you're one and done, it doesn't work that way. Whether you own a business or you're building a park, it's just, humans can be so, I don't know what it is, but we think that everything needs to happen overnight, and it's just, you didn't happen overnight. Nobody does. So let's like be there, and that's why it is important, I think, to have partners that can actually help do it. Like we were fortunately able to do it as a we were able to raise a little bit of money to do it, and overall I think we saved like our city money, as we built these kind of relationships, with store owners, and Department of Sanitation, Parks Department, our trees lasted longer, that wasn't, an investment that died, because we know that there's a huge mortality rate, for urban street trees. So we feel really good about what we did. And again, that whole not particularly sexy talk about cost avoidance, or what it actually means in the lives of people who experience this. It's sort of hard, but I think people kind of just sort of on an sentient basis like understand it.
Nicole, when you get a chance to work with the projects like this, you or NOAA more broadly, does that influence the organization, and does that carry on to the next project or other grants in other communities? And do you have any examples of anything like that?
One of the things I think we try and do is to take the lessons from one and go to the other. We do a lot of full stakeholder engagement of our processes and development of our processes and how we approach things. So we're always getting feedback. We do a lot of code development of our products and services with communities. So we don't just say, we're from the government, we're here to help, here's the project, or here's the thing, just I hope you enjoy it. We really do ask a lot of questions about what they need, begin to develop it, maybe do some co-development with them, and then come back around and say, is this what you expected? It's really an iterative process for a lot of the services we provide. One of the big things we provide is information, so that people of all walks of life within a community can go to a website and see the same information as everyone else is seeing, so that they can get on the same page and they can have conversations within their community about what that means to them, and they can spread that word in a way that makes sense for them. And so that's one of the things we try and not only design with our stakeholders and with communities, but then learn from that and take it to the next one. We do a lot more sort of after action analysis and evaluation than I've ever really experienced across different parts of my career, where we don't just come in and do something and self-assess that it was successful, right? We go and ask, and we ask again, and then we take those lessons to the next one, because we don't want it to be a one and done. We want it to really foster a sense of purpose and community, and then do it again. And none of the models that we follow are going to be the same as the next one. There will be common threads, but the main common thread is that service delivery model, where we ask again and again, and reevaluate and go back and look. Finding metrics that you can use to measure success is so hard. You don't always know what is going to bear out in information later. And so, you know, Majora's probably being asked, how can you tell it succeeded? It's pretty, right? But what did it bring tangibly to the community? Is there more people that live here? Are they demonstrably happier? Do they make more money? Do they buy at our restaurants? You know, and it's so hard to predict all those ways to measure your success. And we try and do that, and we try and work with communities to figure out what that's going to be, so that they can go back and say, you know, something meaningful, like the trees did live longer. Yeah. You know, we pay $100 a tree, and that matters, you know. And so if you don't have those kind of performance metrics really set with the community to begin with, then, you know, 5 years later when they say, well, it was the right thing to do, that doesn't always keep the funding coming to support the maintenance of projects, right? So helping to provide avenues to co-develop ways to really measure success that they can keep showing year after year.
Majora, I'm going to just directly read a question that came in here. It says, as a young African-American marine biologist, UCSB PhD student, I relate to your experience with bringing our communities to natural space. During such a polarizing time, how do you find ways to communicate the importance of environmental issues to communities without increasing that divide?
Yeah, I mean, I think we just have to remind folks of you know, where they're from. I mean, just historically, you know, you're in San Diego. I'm not sure if you're from there or not, but you know, I know for my folks, you know, we're from down south, and you know, my dad always and my mom, they would like go to the creek, or they pronounced it crick because they had southern accents. But anyway, you know, so it was just, to them, it was very much like a part of the culture. And it always is a part of the culture, but then somehow or another, you know, we come here and we think, oh, we're going to be Americanized, or, you know, we're cityfied, or whatever they call it. And suddenly it's just sort of like you leave all that behind. And I think part of what we have to do, you know, as folks who like get it, is that we should be like, this is essentially an extension of embracing our own culture. It's like, why would we think that somehow or another, you know, the natural environment wasn't built for us as well? Like, that doesn't even make any sense. But until, of course, you think about, like, literally, like, you know, the roots, you know, of the environmental movement, where it was just like, don't come into the national parks. Like, just don't. Like, unless you're going to clean them up in some ways that we want you to. And I think that kind of stuff plays into, it's still a part of what, you know, we grew up thinking. And I think, you know, an act of resilience, you know, and strength for our own cultures is recognizing that it's always been a part of us. And it's like, this is just essentially like a way to, you know, just a reclaiming, you know, of that. That's all. Doesn't mean it's all ours. It's none of it's all of anybody's. But just remember, like, who we are, where we're from, and that this, you know, we were, as far as I'm concerned, like, look, I'm a Christian, so this comes out, like, we were all fearfully, wonderfully made by God, that there was, you know, the divine is in all of us. You know, the world was originally was made for us to enjoy, and that includes the natural world. So as long as we take care of it, we should enjoy it. And sometimes that means we have to build it again. And we should take that, you know, as a sign of resilience in our own communities.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Majora, here's a specific question to the neighborhood and about improvements that you've been part of and property values. And yeah, someone's asking, you know, has it driven up rents? Has it made it harder for people to access the community? What's happened in South Bronx or other places you're familiar with?
You know, the problem is that we can't really separate environmental restoration from economic development or from social development. They're all really related, right? And so the problem that we experience from and I could use the South Bronx as a case study for pretty much any place in the country. So there was, you know, the kind of federal housing policy that made it difficult, you know, for Black families and other families of color to obtain financing to stay in their place when they finally were able to do so after white flight. You know, and then the communities would kind of like be changed and challenged, and they were disenfranchised, and then suddenly reurbanization happens. But and then white folks, and developers who realize like, oh wait, those areas are actually close to public transit, and everybody wants some of that. But the problem is that somewhere along the line, we in communities like this were led to believe that our communities actually really weren't that valuable. And that's why we measured success to get away from them. That's why, when someone would say, oh, I'll buy your house for cash, a predatory speculator, I'll buy your house for cash, we would immediately go, this crap in this neighborhood, I'll take the money. And there is literally decades worth of that happening, within our communities. We're seeing the impact of it right now. But it's the reurbanization, of American cities that actually led to the gentrification that we're seeing right now. That was a big piece of it. No one wants to talk about it, but that is absolutely some of it. So some of what we have to do, and I do feel like it's exhausting just to even think about it. But part of it is like, the triage is part of it is helping people in our own communities see the value in them right now, so that we could be the keys to its own economic and environmental redevelopment and recovery. So it means that, as opposed to, that's why we have a talent retention strategy in our real estate practice, because the people we're looking at first are the people that were born and raised in the community, so that they want to stay and invest because they can often afford to, and then as opposed to going and investing in somebody else's neighborhood. So what we have to do is recognize that, and I'm not saying that it hasn't had an impact. Of course it has had an impact, but we can do nothing, and just be upset, that property values are changing and that they're not affecting, our own communities. Or we can go to the people that actually do own some property in our communities and make sure they keep it to create generational wealth for their own families, and then support other folks to do it. And that's where we do need the help of agencies and public officials, because, for places where there's high tax rates, and that's one of the reasons why property taxes, why people, when the area gets gentrified, property taxes go up in poor neighborhoods, and poor folks are unable to pay it. Tax relief programs, it can be done, or are there first-time home buyer, places for people within our own communities? Are there opportunities for business development? And this is where I think if we can't do this at this point in American history, where everybody understands that the reason why, the wealth gap is what it is, because it was discrimination and literally access to capital and opportunities for people to be up to live the American dream. So we have to be real mindful. And then what I think we'll see is our communities in general, and I don't care what color they are actually, but there's definitely, the more of color they are, it's a problem, but the poor communities as well, the poor white ones, they to some extent deal with this too. That is a class issue as well. So we have to recognize that as we support, folks in their own communities to be a part of its economic recovery, everything else will change and be supported as well, because they'll be easily fighting for their own communities, because they'll be able to do so. And then more people, a lot of more people with economic diversity will be able to benefit from the health and well-being of those communities. So I don't mean to like Pollyanna-ish at all, but we got to do something, and it just can't be, identifying the problem. It's like, what do you do after you identify the problem? You look for a solution, and I think that's some of it.
Great. One of the questions was, have you found opportunities to engage school-age kids in any of these programs that you've worked on, and where do the youth fit into this?
Oh, what's really nice is that they're easier than adults. They just, they get it. And fortunately, there's a lot, in particular around here and in other places where I've had the good fortune of working, around the country. There's generally like a really good, whether it's educators, who see the value of using the natural resources and using it as a part of their classroom. So even sometimes, like one of the things that would happen, there would be like reading groups that would literally happen in the park. Like they would just like, oh, it's time for reading hour or whatever. And they'd walk down to the park, and then they have it there. And then there were like different trees up, so then they do like tree identification, that kind of stuff. So sort of like making it a part of their lives, so that it was, that again, it was normal. Or, that there's been, also using it as like real people could to study, because there's also the ecological, opportunities here. There's actually a SUNY Maritime, State University of New York Maritime College, and so they actually will do studies around here. And again, people see that stuff and it's just like, well, what are you doing? And it really makes life, easier, I think, for folks to sort of see themselves, in the environment without it being like, hammering it on, like, you got to love the environment. It's just like, no, this is a really interesting thing. You might learn something. And again, I find that younger people are just easier, to access, and they just see it as like a normal thing to do in their community. And there's enough programming around specifically for that. I feel really comfortable with them going, yeah, this is, I love it. They think it's like been here. Like for young people, I'm cool with them thinking it's been, because it actually has been there their entire lives. It's the adults, it's just sort of like, really, like, guys, is this whatever. But it's wonderful at the same time. I'm just happy people love it.
That's great. We just have a couple minutes left, and I want to touch on one question. We could go for hours probably on this one, but I'll maybe give each of you a chance to comment on it and wrap up before we let folks go. It's from someone who works in estuaries and is talking about someplace near New York City that's the community is become a hotspot for the white community to vacation at. And as they do restoration work and engagement, it sounds like it's just really easy for the white vacationers to be overrepresented. And so the question is, how do you initiate conversations and engagement with the communities that historically are left out, and engage with folks that are surrounded by, but also segregated by the estuary in this case?
So I just want to make sure. So it's a community. So is it an integrated community, or where you're doing the restoration? I'm not quite.
My sense from the question is that this would be a community that underrepresented folks are living nearby, but it is now a vacation hotspot. And so white people descend on the weekends, and they probably are dominating and driving what's going to be done, as opposed to the folks that have lived there. And this individual's I assume, doing some restoration work, and is probably fighting this tide to speak to the white homeowners and the Airbnbs and the VRBOs, as opposed to the community that lives and works there.
Right. And I think finding, who, whether they're sort of like, I would look for the non-traditional leaders, within the community who basically feel excluded and who have their own networks of people. I don't know if it's like somebody who runs like a local, grocery store or a church or whatever, but finding those folks and just being like, this is your neighborhood, these restoration, this is going to be here long after, the folks just, sort of discover this place. And, it's, you need to be represented in it. I mean, not because, I'm telling you, but because this is yours. And recognize that on some level, again, going back to like one of the earlier like problems that I had in my own neighborhood, with people just being like, that's not for me. If they've been around a place that has not been treated well, and so and I think one of the worst things you can do, with a natural resource is not treat it well, because then people start to think and not maintain like, for example, a park that's not maintained is worse than no park at all, because people will feel like, oh, that's what happens when it comes here. So why did I want it? It was better than it wasn't even here. So, and I think, so acknowledging that, it didn't happen before, and that, and we need to make it right. So, and it's going to be hard, like, because that's what I'm sure people are thinking is like, wow, they didn't even start doing anything until white people started showing up here.
Yeah.
And that may or may not be true, but it is certainly what people saw. And you have to deal with that. And those are the difficult conversations that people need to have. And I think, but starting it with questions like, notice that, only white people show up for these meetings or whatever. And, what does that mean? Can you tell me why? And, if you keep showing up, people will tell you, and use that to inform, how you continue to do outreach.
Majora, that's great. And that was probably a bad moderator move on me to ask such a juicy question when our time is almost up. But I want to thank you both. And Nicole, thank you so much. Majora, thank you so much. Your brilliance is really wonderful to be part of. And thank you all to the 100+ folks who've been part of this conversation. We'll look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thank you.
Take care.
Are we gone?
I assume they're kicking us out slowly.
Oh, are we coming back to?